The Institute for Gilgit Baltistan Studies therefore calls for demilitarization of Gilgit Baltistan, promotion of genuine autonomy and democracy, withdrawal of extremist elements, reinstatement of state-subject rule, and people-to-people contact between Ladakh and Gilgit Baltistan. It asks Pakistani rulers to empower local political institutions, including granting absolute legislative authority over the natural resources, tourism, and trade to the Legislative Assembly in Gilgit. I once again thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this opportunity.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank all of you. I also want to just add for the record that in addition to the statements made by the witnesses today, I would like to officially submit into the record written testimony from First Peoples Worldwide, an NGO who advocates for Indigenous rights and who has provided us with information regarding the Asian Indigenous groups that we are discussing today. Furthermore, I would like to submit for the record testimony from J.P. Raju, the Adivasi leader from the National Adivasi Alliance, testimony from Nick Wirch and Padma Priya of Samata, India, a tribal rights advocacy group, and testimony from Lorena Vaca of the Indian Law Resource Center. I would like to thank everyone who has worked to help put together this very helpful information, so I want the record to reflect that. First, I want to thank all of you for your testimonies, and I want to thank you for your advocacy of the various Indigenous groups that we're discussing here today. You know, we're gathering in Washington, D.C., and a lot of the governments of the countries where the peoples we're talking about reside have big embassies here. They have very expensive paid lobbyists, and they advocate for their economic interests and their military interests very effectively. As a result of that, they're a constant presence. But very rarely do the issues that we are discussing here today come up in the conversations that we have with the official governments and with their paid lobbyists. And you know, part of what we're trying to figure out here, and as part of this commission, is how the United States can be a better advocate for human rights at every level, and including a better advocate for human rights for Indigenous peoples around the world. So if I could just ask a couple of general questions just to kind of set the scene as to where we are right now. You have been working with various Indigenous groups in Asia for quite some time. How do you assess the impact or the role of the United States in terms of being an advocate for human rights, an advocate for proper representation, an advocate to prevent lands from being taken away from various Indigenous groups? I mean, has the United States been out front? Have we been way behind? Have we been somewhere in the middle? I mean, how do you assess our role up to this point? Have we been too silent? You've mentioned a number of things that we can do. I appreciate that, but I guess I'm trying to figure out what have we been doing. And this is open to all of you. Ms. Richardson?
It's a big question. I would say that the U.S. has arguably been marginally better than, for example, the EU or member states, or indeed other more progressive governments within Asia. But I think as a general matter, there's still a great deal more that the U.S. can and should do. And often, I think the U.S.'s defense of the rights of Indigenous people, either individuals or communities, often gets tangled up, as is usually the way, with larger geopolitical interests, or in some instances with respect to U.S. corporate interests. If you follow, for example, the case that's making its way through federal court in the U.S. against Exxon on behalf of some Acehnese in Indonesia, there's a classic example of Indigenous people's land rights being absolutely trampled upon, and it's taking years and years and years of very high-profile, very complicated, and frankly very expensive litigation to get a U.S. company to comply. And the U.S. government has tried, I think on a couple of occasions, either to kill the case entirely rather than speak out, I think, quite effectively on behalf of the Indigenous people.
Ms. Eka?
This is a difficult question to answer because this is a how can I say, an Indian internal security matter, internal affairs matter, and as such, the U.S. just does not go in there as much. But I think what can be done is that when aid work happens in India through USAID, etc., that there be a mandate that there be more focus on indigenous people and working with them.
Well, but let me just give you an example. For example, the Adivasi leaders have a relationship with our embassy in India. I mean, if there's a human rights abuse, is there a point of contact? Do we respond if lands are being taken away in an unjust way, or if a U.S. corporation is behaving in a way that is an adverse impact on the community? Is there a relationship there in which the U.S. responds, or?
Yes, I don't think there is a strong relationship yet. Yeah, the dialogue is more on a national level, regional level, than on an international level.
But it would seem to me that if our embassy were more sensitive to some of the realities of the community, that would actually be a good thing. Or at least it would take away the excuse that no one's talked to us,
Yeah.
But I appreciate it. Ms. Quigley?
I'd have to agree with Sophie that it's sort of like marginally better than other progressive countries.
That's not an enthusiastic endorsement of great,
well, I guess I have some, like, for the case of Burma and sort of like our indigenous communities, the U.S. has basically a mixed response. Recently, Assistant Secretary Schwartz had been to Bangladesh and had been very vigorously pursuing the harsh treatment in which their refugees and the unofficial refugees are facing in Bangladesh. Less so is the U.S. responding on the political front when it comes to indigenous rights. We hear a tremendous amount of talk, particularly from this administration, on pursuing engagement. And one of the things that we've been advocating for was that means with all parties. And for them, it sort of meant Aung San Suu Kyi is released from house arrest, and there's a new, quasi-new sheen of civilian government over the military junta, and so the engagement there. And we're like, well, you have a tremendous amount of ethnic minorities, you have a tremendous amount of indigenous communities that the ceasefires are going to end, there's going to be renewed armed conflict, this is going to be taking place in an area where China is trying to build hydropower plants, natural gas pipelines, the regime is doing the dirty work for them, and we're not really seeing a response from our embassies in the region at all about reaching out to these communities and understanding what their needs are and what they need from the U.S. government. And this is sort of like, I feel like we're talking to a brick wall with the administration. That said, Congress has been very responsive in trying to, again, sort of like us, talk to a brick wall about reaching out to these communities and bringing them into this process. And it's just not happening, with the exception, like I said, of Assistant Secretary Schwartz reaching out to the regional governments on the issue of treatment of them as refugee populations. And
Assistant Secretary Schwartz is a good guy, but I think he's leaving.
Yes.
So that's Mr. Saring.
Thank you, sir. Well, the United States has been dealing with different countries, and the case is different when it comes to each individual case, but I'll talk in context of Pakistan. And I would say that, the United States has to walk a really fine line because its dependence on Pakistan to eliminate terrorism in the area is very important. But at the same time, it has taken some steps in Gilgit Baltistan that is very encouraging. For instance, investment in health and education projects. So when we compare the United States with, let's say, China, which is only interested in building dams in the region or building roads that will connect China with Iran and the Pakistani ports, United States' interest in capacity building at micro level, providing for the local people for basic health and education benefits, it's very promising. But I would say that, as Ms. Jennifer said, there's a difference between how State Department would deal with Pakistan and how Congress would deal with Pakistan. And State Department has largely tried to promote the interest of Islamabad, whereas, in State Department we have more hope that there are certain representatives who are interested in extending their support to the indigenous community.
Right. I guess what I'm trying to get at is, we have embassies all over the world, and sometimes expressing concern doesn't have to be so confrontational. It could be something as simple as the human rights officer or the development officer going into a community and just listening and learning, and then reporting back to Washington as to what the realities are. advocating for human rights doesn't always have to be confrontational. There are various ways that you can do it, and advocating for people's rights doesn't always have to be confrontational. It can be done in a way that hopefully you bring the government along with you, to try to be more sensitive and more responsive to some of the concerns of the indigenous communities. And I'm always amazed that when I go to certain countries, or when I visit indigenous communities, that no one from our government has ever been out to listen and to learn. And I think sometimes just by going out to listen and learn, that in and of itself is a signal, a powerful signal. Let me ask you, considering the frequent denial of civil and political rights to indigenous communities, how effective are grassroots organizations in promoting their own rights? Do these internal efforts have the potential to be successful on their own, or is there a role for outside organizations and governments? Well, Ms. Richardson?
It varies enormously. For example, the land law I was speaking about in Cambodia was not necessarily the result of advocacy on behalf of indigenous organizations inside the country. There was some of that, but that wasn't the main driver, and yet it led to one of the better pieces of legislation we've seen across the region. At the other end of the spectrum, you're talking about people whose very ideas, that they have ideas or want to discuss peacefully self-determination, can get them, a 15 to 20-year sentence in prison, and their ability to organize in any way or effectively articulate those concerns, even within the legal framework of a given country, can be extremely problematic. That's one of the problems that we've seen over and over and over again, that even trying to have a discussion about, for example, having the autonomy laws in China upheld to their fullest extent, right? So even people having a peaceful conversation about existing legislation that ought to be upheld winds up getting people jail sentences. And those are some of the circumstances where having others weigh in and say, this is what they're entitled to do, could be helpful.
Ms. Sacco?
I think there are different places where it's more effective for the grassroots organization to work, and other places where international pressure does help. For example, my state, Jharkhand, was created only 11 years back. In India, states are drawn along linguistic lines, and just that nobody ever felt the need that indigenous people should have their own state. And it took years and years of lobbying by various regional political groups to get that. But on the other hand, we have, like Sophie was mentioning, activists or people who are fighting for indigenous rights who get branded as traitors. One would be the case of Dr. Binayak Sen, who was a doctor, and he was just treating people who have violently dissented against the government, and he was branded as a traitor and thrown into jail. So for people like that, yes, international voice and international pressure does help.
Ms. Quigley?
In the case of Burma, for the Rohingya and for sort of the other indigenous minorities in Burma, it's been critical to have a partnership between the grassroots organizations, the people on the ground who are collecting the information. They understand what the problems are and what the solutions are with the international community. And it's been that partnership that has sort of been the driving force behind how it is that they're going to be able to affect change inside. Particularly in the case when it comes to getting information out. And so in learning about the atrocities that are taking place against these communities, we rely on the grassroots networks inside the country to relay that information to, say, outside groups like ourselves, and then to get international actors to respond to that, to apply pressure on the Burmese regime, because the Burmese regime doesn't really care how the grassroots feel about the situation, but they do care about how the international community feels. And so it's that partnership that has been critical towards inching closer to maybe some sort of semblance of rights in the future of Burma.
Saring?